There's a kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the silence in a room where everyone has already made up their mind about you, and they're just waiting for you to figure that out. I've thought about Loretta Vane a lot since the day this story found me, and every time I do, I think about that silence. The way it sat in that conference room on the 14th floor of the Dunmore and Hatch building in downtown Toronto, thick as January fog off Lake Ontario. I think about the look on the faces of the people in that room, the half-smiles, the exchanged glances, the careful practiced blankness that expensive people wear when they want to be cruel without being accountable for it. And I think about her, sitting there, hands folded, not flinching once. This is the story of what happened next. The Dunmore and Hatch auction house had been in business for 61 years by the time that particular Tuesday rolled around. It occupied 3 floors of a glass tower at the corner of Bay and King, and it smelled the way old money always smells, like cedar and printer ink and the faint ghost of cigarettes from a decade when smoking indoors was still a thing people did without apology. Jeffrey Ashmore, 53, the firm's senior estate appraiser, a lean, silver-templed man with the kind of posture that suggested he had never once sat in a chair that cost less than $2,000, had arranged everything himself. The conference table, the lighting, the catered lunch from the Italian place on Adelaide that only took reservations 3 weeks out. He had even specified the coffee, a single-origin Kenyan roast served in bone china cups with the firm's crest on the side. Jeffrey Ashmore did not do things halfway. That was the reputation, and he guarded it like a property line. The occasion was the appraisal of the Pelletier estate. Claude Pelletier had died 11 weeks earlier at the age of 84 in his Victorian home in Westmount, Quebec, though the bulk of his collection had spent the last 30 years in a climate-controlled storage facility in Mississauga because Claude had trusted Ontario's winters less than Montreal's. He had been, in certain circles, considered one of the most important private collectors of early 20th century Canadian art in the country. Group of 7 originals. Pre-Confederation documents. A Krieghoff, possibly 2. And one piece that Jeffrey Ashmore had been thinking about since the estate lawyer first called him in March. A pen and ink study attributed to Tom Thomson, dated 1916, unsigned but documented in 3 known letters that had not been seen publicly since 1974. The heirs were 2. A son named Bryce Pelletier, 41. A commercial real estate developer who wore his watch on the outside of his cuff and said, at the end of the day, approximately 7 times in every conversation. And a daughter. Her name was Loretta Vane, née Pelletier, 38 years old. She arrived 7 minutes late, which Jeffrey Ashmore noted with the particular disapproval of a man who considers punctuality a moral position. But it was the other things he noted first, before the time, before anything else. The coat, an old parka, olive green, the left cuff fraying at the seam. The boots, sensible, worn, the sole of the right one starting to separate just slightly at the toe. Her hair pulled back with what appeared to be a plain elastic band. No jewelry except small, plain stud earrings. No briefcase. She carried a canvas tote bag from the annex-used bookstore on Bloor. She sat down across from her brother without ceremony and folded her hands on the table. Bryce Pelletier looked at her the way he always looked at her. Like she was something left behind after everyone else had packed up and gone home. "Glad you could make it," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Loretta Vane said nothing. She looked at the coffee service and poured herself a cup. Jeffrey Ashmore introduced himself and his colleagues. Perrin Sloan, 46, the firm's authentication specialist, with the quick eyes of someone who spent her days looking for things other people had missed, and Douglas Hatch Jr., 61, the firm's managing director and the grandson of one of the original founders, who had the bearish, comfortable look of a man who had never lost a negotiation and saw no reason to start. The 4th person in the room was someone Jeffrey had brought in as a courtesy. A specialist from the AGO's conservation department, a Dr. Neha Kapoor, 39, who consulted for estates when pieces of national significance were involved. We'll begin with the overview of the collection, Jeffrey said, clicking open his laptop. The Dunmore and Hatch assessment places the total estate in the range of 4.3 to 5.1 million, pending final authentication of the Thompson study. That piece alone accounts for approximately 40% of the total, Loretta said. Jeffrey paused. Yes, he said, that's correct. And the authentication is pending because? Because the provenance documentation has a gap, Perchin Sloan said, not unkindly. Between 1974 and 1987, we have no confirmed chain of custody. The letters are compelling, but letters are not enough on their own. We need either a third-party expert endorsement or a physical examination by a certified Thompson specialist. Okay, Loretta said. When does the specialist arrive? The pause that followed was the kind of pause that carries information in it. That's actually one of the things we wanted to discuss today, Jeffrey said carefully. There are 3 recognized Thompson authentication specialists in the country. One has a conflict of interest. She worked with Bryce's development firm on a project in Oakville 4 years ago. One is currently in Japan and unavailable until October. And the third passed away in February, Perrin Sloan said. Arthur Cresswell. He was 79. Bryce Pelletier leaned back in his chair with the look of a man who had already done the calculation and was comfortable with the answer it produced. So what we're saying is that proper authentication isn't really on the table right now. And given the estate tax situation, waiting until October isn't ideal for anyone. For some of us, Loretta said. Bryce looked at her. What's that supposed to mean? It means October is fine with me. He laughed. A short, flat sound. Right, easy for you to say. You don't have carrying costs. Some of us have mortgages, Loretta. Some of us have... I know what you have, Bryce. The room went quiet again. Douglas Hatch Jr. took a long sip of coffee and set the cup down with the kind of care that expensive china demands. There may be another option, Jeffrey said, steering. We have a colleague in Montreal, Pierre Arsenault, very well regarded, who has worked with Thompson-adjacent materials before. Not a specialist per se, but experienced. He's willing to offer an informal assessment which would allow us to move forward with a preliminary valuation while we pursue formal authentication in parallel. Informal meaning unverified, Loretta said. Informal meaning provisional. Those are the same word dressed differently. Perrin Sloan looked at her then, a look that was not dismissive. Something else was happening behind her eyes. Bryce set both palms flat on the table. Look, I think what my sister is having trouble understanding is that this piece has sat in a box in Mississauga for 30 years. Dad never talked about it, never displayed it, never, as far as I can tell, gave a single thought to what would happen to it after he was gone. The practical reality is that we have a window to move this estate while the market is right. And I'd like to take that window. Dad talked about it, Loretta said. A beat. He talked to me about it, she said. Quite a bit, actually. Bryce's smile thinned. He talked to everyone about everything near the end. That doesn't mean. He told me where he got it. The room was still. He told me the name of the woman who sold it to him. He told me the year. He told me the story she told him when she handed it over. Loretta picked up her coffee cup. And he told me something else. Jeffrey Ashmore had been appraising estates for 26 years. He had a sense, honed by decades of practice, for the moments when a conversation changed rooms, the way a house's whole atmosphere shifted when you opened a certain door. He felt it now. What did he tell you? Perrin Sloan asked. She had leaned forward just slightly. Loretta set the cup down. She reached into the canvas tote bag from the annex bookstore. She set a folder on the table. Plain manila, slightly bent at one corner, with a handwritten label in an old man's careful cursive. He told me that he'd always meant to do something about it, she said, and that he was sorry he'd run out of time. Inside the folder were 4 things. The first was a letter, handwritten, dated September 2003, from a woman named Paulette Arcand of Temiskaming, Quebec. It described, in careful detail, her grandmother's account of purchasing the pen and ink study from a Toronto art dealer in 1918. 2 years after Thompson's death at Canoe Lake, along with the dealer's name, the price paid, $12, and the dealer's address on Yonge Street, which no longer existed but which Loretta had cross-referenced against city directories from 1917 and 1918, photocopies of which were also in the folder. The second was a photograph, black and white, printed on cardstock, showing a woman sitting in a parlor. On the wall behind her, clearly visible, was the pen and ink study. The back of the photograph read, Témiscamingue, 1931. Celeste Arcand in the front room. The third was a bill of sale, handwritten, in French, dated 1964, showing the transfer of the study from the Arcand family estate to a Montreal art dealer named Lebrun. The dealer's stamp was on the bottom right corner. The fourth was a second bill of sale, dated 1971, from Lebrun Gallery to a private buyer, Claude Pelletier, with a Montreal address, and a price, and the dealer's initials in the corner, pressed in faded blue ink. The gap was not a gap. The chain was unbroken. Perrin Sloan picked up the 1931 photograph very carefully by the edges, the way people who know things handle fragile things. She brought it close. She tilted it toward the light. No one spoke for a long time. Then Dr. Neha Kapoor, who had been quiet through the entire meeting, said in a voice that was completely steady, "May I see the bill of sale from Lebrun?" Loretta slid it across the table. Dr. Kapoor looked at it. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the letter from Paulette Arcand of Témiscamingue. "Where did you find the Arcand letter?" she asked. "Dad's desk," Loretta said. "Bottom drawer, behind the hanging files. And the photograph, same place. He'd had them for years. He just never did anything with them." Dr. Kapoor set the bill of sale down and clasped her hands in front of her on the table. "I need to make a call," she said. "If you'll excuse me for a few minutes." She stepped out. Bryce was looking at the folder with an expression Loretta had seen on his face before. Not quite often, but enough times to recognize it. It was the expression of a man recalculating, adjusting the numbers, deciding what his position was going to be. "Where did you get these?" he said. "I told you. Dad's desk." Dad's desk was inventoried by the estate lawyers. Dad's desk was inventoried by the estate lawyers after I'd already been through it, Loretta said. "I was the one who cleared his study. You were in Calgary that week. You sent me an email." Bryce's jaw shifted. "You should have disclosed this earlier," Jeffrey Ashmore said. "Not accusatory, professional, but pointed." "I'm disclosing it now," Loretta said, "before anything is signed or agreed to." "Why now? Why not when this process began?" Loretta looked at him. She had steady eyes, gray-green, the kind of eyes that don't look away when they don't need to. "Because I needed to understand what I was looking at," she said. "I'm not an art historian. I didn't know if any of this meant anything. I've spent the last 6 weeks finding out." "How?" Perrin Sloan asked. The word came out with a kind of quiet urgency. "I work at the Archives of Ontario," Loretta said. "Municipal records, city directories, that's my job." A silence. "I've been doing it for 12 years, she said. Perrin Sloan looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Jeffrey Ashmore. Something passed between them. Jeffrey Ashmore cleared his throat. "I think," he said slowly, "we may want to reconsider the timeline on this assessment." Bryce made a sound, not quite a word, and Jeffrey held up one hand, professionally, firmly. "The provenance documentation your sister has provided, if authenticated, changes the situation significantly. A fully documented Thompson, and I want to be clear, this would be a fully documented Thompson with unbroken chain of custody from 1918, is not a $4.3 million estate. It's a different conversation entirely." Bryce turned to look at his sister. She was looking out the window, 14th floor, the city spread below them, gray and bright and enormous. A Tuesday in April, and the ice on the lake had finally broken. She did not look satisfied. She did not look like she was enjoying herself. She looked like a woman who had done a quiet, necessary thing and was now letting it be what it was. Dr. Kapoor came back into the room. She sat down. She folded her hands. "I spoke with a colleague in Ottawa," she said, "a provenance researcher with the National Gallery. She knows the Lebrun Gallery records. There's a partial archive at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec. She says if the Lebrun bill of sale is genuine, and if it matches the records in that archive, the authentication case becomes very strong, potentially definitive. How long? Jeffrey asked. 3 to 4 weeks. In my assessment, Dr. Kapoor said, these documents look consistent. The paper stock on the 1931 photograph, the typeface on the Lebrun bill, the handwriting style in the Arcand letter. She paused. I'm not making a formal declaration, but I've been doing this for 15 years, and I am not finding anything here that makes me uncomfortable. Bryce Pelletier sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He exhaled through his nose. He looked at his sister. You knew this whole time, he said. I knew for about 3 weeks, she said. Before that, I had a box of old papers and no idea what they were. You could have told me. I tried to call you twice. You didn't pick up. I sent you an email on the 14th. You replied to the wrong thread. She picked up her coffee cup again, though it was empty now. It's in your inbox, Bryce. I can forward it again if you'd like. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one at the beginning. That first silence had been comfortable for everyone except Loretta. This silence was uncomfortable for everyone except Loretta. She set the empty cup down. I have to get back, she said. I have a 1 o'clock at the archives. She put the folder back in her canvas tote. Then she stopped. Actually, she said, leave those. They're copies. Dad had the originals in his desk, too. The estate lawyers have them now. She looked at Jeffrey Ashmore. I made sure to tell them what they were before they boxed everything up. She stood, buttoned her fraying parka, and picked up her bag. Perrin, she said, and the authentication specialist looked up. The Thompson study, it's still in the facility in Mississauga? Yes, when Dr. Kapoor's colleague confirms the archive records. I'd like to arrange for a proper viewing. I'd like to see it. Dad talked about it for 30 years, and I never saw it in person. Perrin Sloan said very quietly, I'll make sure that happens. Loretta Vane nodded. She thanked Jeffrey Ashmore for the coffee. She said goodbye to Dr. Kapoor. She did not say anything else to her brother. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. Bryce did not follow her. He sat at the conference table with the expression of a man who had prepared to win something and had arrived at an ending he hadn't written. The elevator opened. Loretta stepped in. The doors closed. Downstairs, on Bay Street, the April wind was cold and diesel-smelling and completely indifferent to everything that had happened on the 14th floor. She pulled her parka tighter and turned north toward the subway. In her bag was a library book she'd been meaning to return for 2 weeks, a thermos of coffee from home, now cold, her transit card, and a folded piece of notepaper with a phone number on it. A woman named Suzanne Arcand, Paulette's daughter, who had written to Loretta last week after seeing the estate notice in an online archive forum. My grandmother always said the painting was special, she'd written. She said the man who made it really loved the land. I'm glad it's going somewhere it'll be cared for. Loretta had read that email 4 times. She thought about her father's desk, the bottom drawer, behind the hanging files. She thought about how long those papers had been sitting there, decades, while the thing they described sat in a box in Mississauga waiting. She thought about what her father had said to her about a year before he died. She had driven out to Westmount on a long weekend, just the two of them, and they had sat in his study, and he had shown her the papers and told her the story, the whole story, quietly, like it was something he'd been carrying for a long time and was ready to set down. I always meant to do something about it, he had said. I just kept thinking there'd be more time. She had held his hand. There's still time, Dad. He had squeezed her fingers once. Hard. And then he had changed the subject. She had not known, sitting in his study that afternoon, that it was one of the last conversations they would have. She had driven back to Toronto not quite understanding what he'd trusted her with, but she understood it now. The subway entrance was ahead. She went down the stairs, joining the current of the city, anonymous and unhurried and completely herself. I've told you this story because of what it is, but also because of what it isn't. It isn't a story about money, even though money is in it. It isn't a story about art, exactly, even though a painting sits at the center of it. It's a story about what gets handed down. Not the valuable things, not the impressive things, but the things that require patience to understand. The bottom drawer, the stack of papers, the box no one thought to open. Loretta Vane went back to the archives of Ontario that Tuesday afternoon and spent her 1 o'clock helping a researcher from Winnipeg trace a land deed from 1883. That's the job. That's what she does. 3 weeks and 4 days later, the B&Q archive confirmed the Lebrun bill of sale. Dr. Kapoor's colleague in Ottawa issued a formal statement. The Thompson study for a lake, April 1916, was authenticated as a significant work of national cultural importance. The estate was eventually settled for a number that neither sibling has publicly disclosed. What I can tell you is that Loretta Vane visited the study in Mississauga on a Saturday morning in June, in a viewing room that smelled like climate control and clean silence. It was small, smaller than she had expected. Pen and ink on aged paper. The lake in it was barely sketched, more suggestion than statement. But the light on the water was real. Unmistakably, irrevocably real. She stood in front of it for a long time. The people who run this world assume that authority announces itself, that it wears a good coat, that it arrives on time. They build their conference rooms and their bone china cups and their expensive lunches around the belief that if you look like you belong somewhere, you do, and if you don't look like you belong, you don't. Loretta Vane walked into that room in a fraying parka with a library book in her bag, and she had done 12 years of work that no one in that room had thought to ask about. And she had spent 6 weeks doing the thing she knew how to do, quietly, without announcing it. She didn't need them to take her seriously before she did what she came to do. She just needed them to be in the room when she did it. If that story means something to you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever sat in a room where people had already made up their minds, and you had to wait for the right moment to open the folder, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me your story. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who turned out to be exactly who they needed to be, subscribe to Dell Stories. There's another one coming that I think you're going to want to hear.